Greetings! Before we begin, please keep in mind that I'm just a guy on the internet with an interest in, well, specifically in this case, intriguing psychological effects and behavior, but I have zero academic background. Everything was gathered from all sorts of studies, sources and think pieces that I could find, and some of it even is my personal opinion. I know, shocking. Now, what is the background of this video, the inspiration? Well, to be blunt, I was always interested in finding out how corporations breed their loyal defenders. How does someone turn into a zealot? How does somebody end up defending the billion-dollar company? How do you get people to actively defend anti-consumer actions? And how do you get people to do the dirty work for the corpos? How do you turn a gaming community into a cult? And how does maybe even a gaming company turn into a cult? These and many other questions did I ask, and this is what I was able to find. Let's see what we can learn. Sit back and enjoy this deep dive into some weird online cult rabbit holes. First, let's start with the basic definition, as this will be our first big issue we will be facing. As you will soon learn, online cults don't really work like traditional ones. The cult, from the APA Dictionary of Psychology as a baseline, refers to a religious or quasi-religious group characterized by unusual or atypical beliefs, seclusions from the outside world, and an authoritarian structure. Cults tend to be highly cohesive, well-organized, secretive, and hostile to non-members. Already sounds a bit difficult to fit onto the behavior of online spaces like a game forum, a fandom, Reddit, but for now let's keep going with it. Some common traits. Firstly, they are usually led by a charismatic individual whom the members worship without question. Now, that one is very interesting, as in the case of video game communities and gaming companies, I think these individuals don't exist. They could actually be multiple personalities or an ideology. What do I mean by that? Well, the quote-unquote cult leader in this aspect could be just a community moderator or a leading community member, such as a content creator that holds a lot of influence, or a well-known poster on social media that frequents the site very often, or in the case of the corporations being involved, it could partially boil down to the most prominent community-facing members of the corporation, whoever that is. Or in certain cases, the corporation's ideology and philosophy is being superimposed onto the community. I believe in certain cases completely for video game cults, a defined leader figure that you can directly point to as the origin point and the person responsible, that person does not exist. The leader is more so the idea or the ideology of a game company that the community members follow and defend. But let's see if this theory gets somehow elaborated on in some of my sources. And the other common trait is cult members often live together in their own dedicated community. Now that is obviously talking about actual localized cults, but in this case those closed communities are obviously the Discord groups, chats, Reddits, forums, and we will absolutely talk about these as they have a very strong influence on the indoctrination of no cult members, and they are the primary driver behind cult communities. So how do cults generally operate? Well, there's nothing really new to learn here. They are targeting vulnerable prey. Receptive people are those who are looking to escape something, such as an unhappy life situation or a willing to belong, to be accepted, and to find meaning. The classic case for gaming would be pure escapism. Let's be honest, gamers can be lonely. And all in all, I can argue, I would say, the people who are in these gaming cult communities likely suffer from some sort of mental deficiency, and thus they are very vulnerable to cult tactics. These fandom communities might even take on cult-like aspects without even actively or maliciously trying to do so. That's another topic we'll have to go over later. Then there are the drawing in of new recruits, another classic cult operation. Once the potential recruits are present, the cult members typically love bomb them with validation and positivity. That's a tactic that is like love bombing is either an abusive relation or a cult tactic, and it makes the recruit believe they have found what they're looking for, and it's more likely that they will return to the group. I think this is slightly questionable if this even applies to gaming communities or online communities, because there's a lot of different discussions happening within social spaces around a game, and not all of them are positive or agreeable. It solely depends on how the community space is moderated, how strict or how open it is. I would actually argue some newcomers might actively be turned away from the community depending on their first interactions. Especially the toxic fandom argument comes into play here. So I'm not sure this point can fit onto gaming communities. Then we have the cult taking control, the final step. As they indoctrinate new members, many cults separate them from families, friends, and jobs, slowly remaking their identities to suit the group. They may force recruits to surrender their money, belongings, and bodies to the cult's leader and other members. Sometimes they compel new members to marry people they've just met. They may use punishment, deprivation, and other tactics to wear them down. These efforts, which sometimes include threats, make new members dependent on and afraid to leave the group. Fully indoctrinated members often engage in behavior they would have never considered in their former lives. Now, this once again is only really half applicable to online communities, naturally. Sadly, there is very few scientific studies or material in order to make a more fitting definition. On the other hand, what constitutes as a cult is also very controversially discussed still to this point, so I will just take this actual real-life cult definition and try to apply the points that can fit. Those being the aspect of community punishment. Once you go against the prevailing notion and opinions, there's a real possibility that you lose in-group friends within that specific gaming community, depending on how influential you yourself are. Obviously, if you are a big community content creator with a large following, it is easier to get away with negativity than others, but you might still be labeled as a hater or detractor by members of the community that were friendly with you before. So already we can see this is going to be a bit tricky to apply the generic cult definition to gaming communities, but that is because they work very differently to normal cults, and the method of indoctrination is much more passive and subconscious than you might assume. It turns out online cults sustain themselves much more effectively from within and by their own members through a very few, very difficult to detect dynamics. There's lots of dark patterns and dark psychology involved, and both gaming companies as well as the social media companies hold much of the responsibility in forming the cult-like behavior, from algorithmic nudging to player retention methods. A lot of it has to do with emotional attachment, empathy bubbles, parasocial bonds, and owning the truth, or simply being right, having your opinion validated and being part of the greater collective narrative. Thus, we will go over some of my findings that might explain better on how and why normal video game communities can develop cult-like tendencies. So how do gaming cults form? How do online cults form? Through dark psychology. Dark psychology works through ordinary human instincts, belonging, safety, meaning, and without really knowing, being bent under peer pressure. In the digital age, those pressures don't arrive through charismatic cult leaders in robes. They arrive through group chats, forums, Discord servers, Telegram channels, and anonymous feeds. Spaces where dissent feels dangerous, certainty feels comforting, and repetition slowly replaces thought. And thus we have our first answer that will further be elaborated. Online cults work without the need of a so-called leader entirely. Instead, online cults work through groupthink, authority bias, and social isolation. Classic mechanisms are being weaponized at scale online, producing environments that mirror cult dynamics and accelerate radicalization. That's a big word, and that's a very extreme word. But keep the Helldivers incident in mind when we talk about radicalization or radical actions. It is not just always being racist or right-wing when the word radical is mentioned. So keep that in the back of your head going forward. The articles on that topic don't take that into account. In their write-up, it is more about radical actions such as a call to violence in the political sense. But the Helldivers doxing incidents very much fits that specific spot of a radicalized action within a cult-like group. Let's talk about groupthink first. Belonging becomes more important than being right. You will silence parts of your perception in order to remain inside the group. Online environments supercharge this trade-off because belonging is constant and visible through likes, replies, and statuses. The exclusion is swift and public, especially when the thread or the comment is negatively boosted. And silence is indistinguishable from agreement. That's very important. If you don't disagree, you have not voiced your dissent. Silence is silent support. A lack of resistance emboldens the enablers in the community. You don't see hesitation or doubt. You only see confidence and repetition. Algorithms surface the loudest consensus, not the most thoughtful view. And that is where the social media aspect comes in. The way Twitter, Reddit, and so on is run, it pushes the loudest, most popular opinion to the front and makes it seem like it is the most prevalent and the most correct. Almost all online spaces are algorithmically driven to act and function this exact way, promoting through engagement and likes only, not by how correct or how sound an opinion is. This also is the case for opposing views. It's not just the corporate defenders in their echo chambers, this can just as well be the case for emotionally compromised detractors and grifters. I would, however, always be very careful with that label. Especially grifter is often heavily overused and seldom correctly applied to one person. Realistically, almost every online content creator might be seen as a grifter once monetary incentives are involved. But I tend to at least try and let both sides have the same type of criticism. Let them both have it. I see cult-like behavior on both sides of the discussion around video games, online and in all social media spaces. Usually those critical of the game, though, don't actually belong to an in-group or an insider community of the product. So it's harder to categorize these people. They might come from another cult-like social media space that is, I don't know, primarily built around villainizing modern video games, for example. Within these cult communities, there's usually no product or company involved that additionally influences and indoctrinates users. That's the biggest difference between fandom in groups around a certain game and hater communities. However, let's now talk about the aforementioned self-censorship that's happening within groupthink. One of the most corrosive aspects of groupthink is that no one has to actually enforce it. This is how the online cult community sustains itself, through non-forceful means. People begin to phrase disagreement as jokes, or they have to make ironic and funny dissent posts. They ask questions instead of making statements, and finally, some stop posting altogether. Therefore, once again, falling into submissive silence, which is seen as agreement. When like-minded people talk mostly to each other, their views don't stabilize. They drift toward more extreme views and opinions. This happens through group polarization. What is group polarization? Well, being around like-minded people strengthens our opinions. The more we interact with groups that share our beliefs, the more confident and often more extreme those beliefs become. This shift happens through a few mechanisms. Firstly, through echo chambers. There is that word. It would have happened at one point in time. Echo chambers. A social or digital environment where individuals are mostly exposed to views they already agree with, which is intensifying the polarization. This happens through social comparison. The evaluation of personal opinions and beliefs based on the perceived attitudes and positions of others. This can result in alignment with group norms, often leading individuals to adopt slightly stronger positions to maintain social standing. Essentially, in a cult community, this would lead to more members over time having more refined and strong opinions and beliefs than they initially had before joining the group. Then there is informational influence, a process where exposure to supporting arguments from like-minded individuals reinforces existing beliefs, making them feel more rational and justified. In a gaming space, this would be opinions on the supported and preferred game being more popular and lucrative, independent of what any outside source may say about the game's state, or other similar arguments around a game that we might have heard in the past. We often assess our own views based on what others around us seem to believe. That is social comparison. And it can lead us to take a stronger stance just to stay in line with the group. Then there is informational influence. Hearing arguments that support our beliefs makes them feel more solid. as if we have proof on our side. Together, these facts can make extreme views seem reasonable and necessary. Ask yourself how you end up with a guy being doxxed and losing his volunteering job over a video game. This is how that happens. Then there are two important other aspects to this group dynamic: caution and risk. Both types of behavior can be elevated and influenced by groups who lean towards one of the two approaches, thus leading to indoctrinated community members also adopting a more cautious or a more risky mindset. In gaming, this could, for example, have an effect on in-game spending, behavior that's encouraged by the in-group community, thus leading to larger spending habits because, quote-unquote, everyone is basically doing it. When we spend time in groups that share our views, our confidence tends to grow. We become more certain, less questioning, and more likely to dismiss information that doesn't fit with the prevailing narrative. These shifts can influence how we make decisions, how we listen or don't listen to others, and how we respond when we feel uncertain. Over time, what starts as agreement can turn into a conviction, harder to step back from, especially in spaces where dissent is rare or unwelcome. However, polarization in some cases may be more about signaling group loyalty than actually a deeply held conviction. So basically, when push comes to shove, the real opinions get expressed, even if these deviate from the in-group. This is therefore at least a possibility that cannot be ignored. So in certain in-group mechanics, members of a gaming cult community might just act to belong, while they don't really share the views or opinions. All of this applies to most online social spaces, by the way. This is not specifically somehow limited to online gaming spaces. So why does groupthink feel so safe? Why does it work as a social cohesion and indoctrination method all on its own? It's because it gives members moral clarity. It gives them a shared purpose. And of course, it means you are always on the right side of history. The psychology rewards certainty and punishes ambiguity. When belonging is scarce and identity feels fragile, the group becomes a psychological shelter. In essence, it becomes an echo chamber. So what's an echo chamber? An echo chamber forms when people are repeatedly exposed to the same views. Opposing perspectives are filtered out or framed as illegitimate, and agreement feels natural and disagreement feels completely absurd. Algorithmic curation quietly personalizes reality itself. What you see, what you read and engage with becomes a feedback loop, less of a window onto the world, more of a mirror. Over time, the world doesn't feel contested, it feels settled. All you see is endless agreement, rather than the messy complexity that life really is. Essentially, the machinations of a cult. We infer truth not only from evidence, but from how widely a belief appears to be spread and shared. Echo chambers exploit this very notion by repeating the same ideas in different voices, presenting opinion as an obvious fact, and making dissent statistically invisible. The most important lesson I had to learn by researching all of this is this: exposure doesn't fix it. Exposing in-group cult members to opposing views does not reduce the indoctrination and does not give people a different perspective and does not get them onto a different path. It does not work. This is a study, a field experiment that was conducted that offered a large group of Democrats and Republicans financial compensation to follow bots that retweeted messages by elected officials and opinion leaders with opposing political views. Republican participants expressed substantially more conservative views after following a liberal bot, whereas Democrats' attitudes became slightly more liberal after following a conservative bot. Although the study also lays out that this is specifically for the US and might not be evidence of how non-social media users might react to exposure or how non-Americans might react. Still though, it is the one study I found, and it is evidence that trying to expose indoctrinated cult members to opposing views probably wouldn't work. The answer seems to at least be, it is very unlikely that just exposing people to different opinions gets them out of their echo chamber, because exposure inside an echo chamber often arrives framed as provocation, an attack, or simply proof of enemy stupidity. And you have seen this behavior a million times, no matter what game releases, what is being statistically proven, or what the state of the game actually is, what is factually said by the developers and the press, what is clear as day and visible to everyone. Inside the cult community of that game, those alien and foreign opinions are immediately reframed as idiot hate or uninformed detractors, hurting the community, hurting the game, not wanting success or not letting the developers cook. So a member of the in-group gaming cult will end up defending the prevailing ideas and ideologies as ferociously as you might an attack on your sense of self. Because for many of these cult followers of a game, an attack on the product, the company and the game is an attack on the self and your own identity that has fused with the community and the game or the company. More on fusion later. Algorithms in this sphere always act as silent enforcers and make the issues worse. This is dark psychology by delegation. There is no single manipulator, just incentives doing their work. And as our perspectives shrink, so does our language change with it. Over time and often quietly, outgroups or those we disagree with start to become stupid, evil or corrupt. Nuance collapses, motive is replaced by a moral diagnosis. And here we are finalizing the cult leader theory I had at the beginning. The article does indeed suggest that often there is literally no cult leader, yet the mechanisms are the same. There is no single charismatic leader delivering sermons from a stage. There is no compound, no manifesto pinned to a door. Instead, authority seeps in quietly through tone, repetition, and a subtle social choreography of who speaks with confidence and who stays silent. Power in these spaces is totally ambient. Online authority no longer needs a face. It emerges from patterns. Who posts most often? Whose interpretations go unchallenged? Whose certainty feels calming in the moments of chaos? Influence accrues not through formal power, but through epistemic dominance, which is a fancy way of saying some voices simply quote-unquote get it, while others don't. Legitimacy is rarely established by credentials. It's established by fluency. The person who speaks fastest, frames events most decisively, or claims access to hidden knowledge begins to function as a reference point. No one appoints them, no one votes, and because no one is officially in charge, no one feels responsible for the consequences. On the surface, the group feels decentralized or democratic even. Underneath, it often becomes more rigid than traditional hierarchies because power is harder to locate and therefore harder to challenge. Over time, disagreement doesn't disappear because it's argued down, it disappears because it becomes socially costly to do so. Challenging dominant interpretation starts to feel like disrupting the emotional equilibrium of the group. The dissenter isn't wrong, they're quote-unquote problematic or naive, or they're just not ready to understand. Now let's talk about how these game cultists fuse their identity with that of the $1 million corporation, and how you end up with corpo defenders. This is just the psychological aspect of what a cult community does to the sense of self. We are not even talking about what the corpos themselves are trying to do to pull you on their side. That's for a later point. Let's get into what is known as identity capture or identity fusion, when the group becomes the self. Humans derive self-esteem, meaning, and emotional security from group membership. We don't just belong to groups, we borrow coherence from them. They tell us who we are when the world feels unstable. This is how identity fusion works. Fusion happens due to an insecure attachment or loneliness, leading to cult-like community formations. This happens especially through the us versus them exclusionary identities inherent in game content and communities. Identity fusion is a visceral sense of alignment with an abstracting, such as a group, a cause, or other people. It incorporates these three distinct motivators of group behavior: the personal self, relational ties, and the collective ties to the group. Theoretically, this explains why measures of identity fusion are exceptionally strong predictors of extreme pro-group behavior. Identity fusion is so powerful that it compels people to enact pro-group behaviors even when it is personally costly to do so. Gaming spaces may be particularly conducive to identity fusion. Gaming is characterized by shared and arguably stressful activities. shared experiences are particularly effective in facilitating identity fusion, especially when the experiences are challenging and engaging. Fusion has been found to align with several pro-social outcomes, such as the willingness to help others, but also anti-social outcomes such as hostility, aggression and violence. Many people seek gaming communities for social connection. Gamers are particularly likely to suffer from loneliness, social anxiety and insecure attachment. Communities then are the capacity to offer a sense of attachment, closeness, belonging, security for individuals who need it the most. Insecure attachment is associated with intra-group marginalization and the endorsement of extreme pro-group actions. Fusion with gamer culture was linked to several factors associated with traditional forms of extremism. Oh, here we go, including the willingness to fight and die for gaming culture, dark triad personality traits, narcissism, Machiavellism and psychopathy, as well as all the regular isms like sexism, racism and generally aggressive behavior. Yeah, this study takes this into account too, and the goal of that study is to actually prove whether gamers engrossed in their cult community are more or less motivated to act in extremist ways. And as you see, the study found that the more fused the identity of the gamer is with their community, the more ready they are to act in extremist ways. In this case, the study only took the classics into account. Again, all the ism words that you can think of. But always keep that Helldivers incident in mind. This is the prime example of extremist behavior that is not just one of the generic isms that everybody immediately points to. Extremism, in my mind, can come in many forms, and we know that many harrowing stories have happened on how members of a fandom or an online group has almost, or in some cases did, end up finishing someone's life over a drawing or an opinion, or just because they didn't like that person. Now, not literally killed that person, but drove them into self-deletion. Strongly fused gamers who are lonelier or have insecure attachment styles were particularly strong proponents of extreme behavior in defense of gaming culture. Although players in different gaming communities have similar levels of anti-social and pro-social sentiments, fusion with gaming culture is associated with social toxicity and social positivity differently depending on the gaming environments. What does that mean? Well, players of competitive shooters obviously have a stronger disposition towards aggressive anti-outgroup sentiments and defending their game or hobby, while less severe or less stressful games had way less severe reactions. That makes sense, but I felt like just making this clear. So this study at least suggests that through strong community bonds, an identity fusion occurs where your actual personal identity is linked and aligned with the product, the game, or the company, not only making you more easy to manipulate for the purposes of being a good consumer, but also making the person who had their identity fused much more receptive to extremist thought processes and behavior, especially when their niche or game or their community is somehow threatened. The group's fate thus feels personal. Criticism feels like an attack, an actual attack. And departure from the group feels like personality annihilation. Once identity is fused, external facts lose their corrective power. Once again, proving that just exposing these people to opposing views does nothing once they are fully converted. Evidence that contradicts the group narrative doesn't invite reflection, it provokes only defense. The psyche treats it as a threat to coherence, not a contribution to understanding. At this stage, debate fails not because arguments are weak, but because the stakes have changed. Once identity is fully enclosed within a group, the most powerful form of discipline emerges: self-surveillance. Individuals begin policing their own thoughts, emotions, and language to stay aligned with the group. Groups that offer coherence, purpose, and a sense of being on the inside provide a powerful psychological substitute. A substitute to loneliness, loss of self, transience in life, or other transitional phases a human might be in. Cult-like groups then step neatly into that gap. They don't just explain the world, they explain the person to themselves. Thus, a cult forms in and around a game and its community. Now, how do the corpos take advantage of these cult communities? We are now going to talk about a few unethical corpo tactics to bind you to their product. This is more of my own personal opinion. The article I had as an inspiration here speaks about topics such as addiction, loot boxes, gambling, and other emotionally manipulative retention methods such as FOMO or other time-limited events or monetary restrictions and carrots on sticks. However, I will not be actively quoting this article, as in most cases the author actually tries to defend some of these tactics, something I heavily disagree with. However, it's a good starting point to talk about all of these modern issues plaguing games. This, by the way, could be an entire video on its own, let's be honest. Addiction to video games. Okay, while this topic is still heavily debated, we can at least argue that certain video game mechanics often present in large-scale modern video games, mostly live service titles, at least encourage continued and repeated and sometimes health-detrimental gaming, from weekly or daily challenges, FOMO mechanics, and time-limited events, to pay-to-play, where with enough farming in-game you might eventually be able to buy the next season pass or a skin. Although playing for this goal usually turns into degenerate farming for specific resources without actually having fun or playing the game for the pure enjoyment of the product. In general, many games feel more like daily chores and checklists now, specifically designed to just keep you coming back, or maybe more maliciously keep you roped in. You are on a leash, and thus potentially staying within the ecosystem of the company where you might spend money, the more you are bound and chained to the product. I am, however, still very skeptical of the video addiction claim, like the actual pathological addiction. A better word I would choose is dependency. These game mechanics grow a player's dependency and a strong artificial bind to these honestly meaningless time-wasting mechanics such as the aforementioned FOMO methods or in-game currency earnings, dailies and weeklies and streaks. Mind you, just having dailies and weeklies is not the issue, but making your in-game worth, the monetization, the progress, your account, heavily dependent on fulfilling these and doing so at a streak repeatedly, that's a completely different thing. If the premium currency only comes from these quests, if you can only progress the paid version of a battle pass through these activities, if they are limited and you need to almost do all of them to complete the battle pass, if you miss some of them if you don't do it this week, does that not create a dependency or at least a reoccurring urge in players? Or at least that is the supposed effect that this should have. You keep coming back because as a player, all your progress, your value, the money standing of your account, it depends on these reoccurring FOMO mechanics. If you break the streak, you lose out on a lot of stuff, potentially. Someone deeply engrossed into this player retention system might perhaps develop some dependency behavior and feelings toward that company, especially if they sunk a lot of time and effort into these systems. Perhaps having them taken away, even though this might be better for them, suddenly goes against their interest. Thus you end up with players actually defending the most degenerate gameplay mechanics you have ever seen. This is how you get corpo shield drones that go to bat for the $1 million company. Since these players got literally hooked on that superficial weekly dopamine return, or they simply don't want to be taken out of their perceived comfort activity. Again, repetition and conformity breeds submissive minds. What would happen if you couldn't grind the mindless weekly missions for the battle pass anymore? That's a horrifying thought. While this is not an addiction per se, it's still some sort of player cohesion, and it is one small example on how cultish player behavior might be nourished through actual game mechanics. The attention economy is geared towards capturing the hearts and minds of most devout players and keep them within the ecosystem as paying customers. Children are particularly vulnerable to these type of streak-based engagement mechanics. That is why a lot of companies set a daily and weekly limit for the gain of resources and the currency or the battle pass progress, but they leave the paid progression method available for those who want to get that extra bit of progress, or maybe they are too enamored to stop. Similarly to a child not having impulse control over the amount of candy they consume, in a game's case, limiting the free progression per week might lead to those with less impulse control, such as perhaps man-children, to purchasing the additional battle pass ranks or other things in order to unlock something bigger earlier than other players. And now you have sunken time and sunken money into the product. You are doubly bound, so to say. Also, game studios use the term addictive as a positive marketing slogan, so I guess in their eyes, even if pathological game addiction was fully proven, it was just be a benefit to them. And let's be honest here, it is feasible that someone who is emotionally, financially and maybe even pathologically invested, depending and hooked on a game, more likely to lash out against negative attitudes towards the product, franchise and the company? The answer is probably yes. The same can be said about loot boxes or other types of gambling mechanics, where either real-world currency or earnable in-game premium currency is used. This is not only just quite literally gambling, no matter if you want to look at it from the legal or the psychological perspective or whether or not companies should be allowed to do it, it is just gambling. No matter if real currency is involved or not, no matter if you can cash out or not, ethically, it is just gambling. And also predatory. Again, this encourages overcommitment to a game, especially if once again the loot box can be earned through in-game premium currency that then once again can be earned through playing to get the premium currency. Once again, gameplay devolves into degenerate purpose farming for such premium currency if it can be earned in-game. And then it is spent on loot boxes or perhaps some sort of time-limited exclusive rare item that's in the loot box. That is a combination of gambling and FOMO, by the way. That's a double combination. Playing the game in a degenerate, non-normal way only for the purposes of gaining the contents of a random loot box is exactly how a company pushes and fights to steal your time and attention. And in any case, the option to buy the loot boxes are still open. Thus, should you be completely unsuccessful in your weeks of farming for that rare time-limited item in the loot box, you are then encouraged to finally fork over some of your real money to gamble. Once again, time and money sunk, consumer bound, made dependable. If this reoccurs a significant amount of time, what kind of effect does this have on the community and behavior of the players? Are those players who are heavily invested through these mechanics positively or negatively predisposed against critique or even possibly closure of the studio or loss of access to the game and to these mechanics? Are these players going to make pro or anti-consumer decisions? We can also quickly talk about whaling. This is essentially the end point of this money and time-based indoctrination and player dependency. A whale has spent unreal amounts of money, and thus a whale will defend the product to the day they die. Makes sense since whales are the epitome of the sunk cost fallacy. Lastly, let's be honest, these are all dark patterns. The dark patterns of modern video game development, as in a game manipulating you to do something you would normally not do. Mostly in this case, the degenerate farming to upkeep the monetization and engagement mechanics, whatever those may be. In all of these cases, business revenue and business tactics are always placed above the player's actual financial and psychological well-being, thus leading to unhealthy behavior and unhealthy minds. Prime real estate for cult influence and behavior. Most of the time, it's not even the fault of the developers, who are the people who have to unfortunately implement these mechanics. It's obviously in the hands of the executives and the investors to not exploit their player base. But as you know, who in the hell still cares about consumer rights in the current year anyway? Corporate oversight, popularization, and disinformation running rampant on social media platforms can also partially contribute to in-group members perceiving the outer world incorrectly or literally just receiving false information. In general, this means that when in an in-group, such as Reddit, of a certain gaming community around a company or product, it is less ideal for Reddit, for the company, the corporate overlords, the product, and sometimes the moderators on the subreddit to let negative sentiment and posts to the front page. You don't want that sentiment to spread. Thus, in certain cases, either these threads are deleted if possible and feasible, or the rules are somehow changed, or a particular discussion is contained in a pinned or isolated thread, so to stop the issue from re-emerging or multiple threads from being created. Now, this does clean up the Reddit, but it can also effectively stifle the discussion around a critical or negative aspect of the game or company, as pinned or mega threads are sometimes ignored or fall into obscurity over time, especially if multiple pins and mega threats exist. This way, maybe not even intentionally, the in-group is shielded against harmful outsider opinions, or in this case, negative or critical opinions on a specific topic. It should be noted, this is very important, that not every Reddit or social media forum operates this way. Some do allow critiques, and some allow multiple open threads if the issues are current and urgent. In a way, this unintentional or sometimes intentional isolation and insulation against foreign thought or different opinions fosters a cult-like community, if it hasn't already formed inside the group. At least such behavior is a breeding ground for cult-like tendencies to emerge. Then there is the lack of accountability on platforms such as Reddit or X. That also plays into the aspect of a community cult as well. Seldom, only rarely, is negative behavior actually punished. And if such behavior somehow also benefits the in-group and in certain cases the community platforms such as Reddit, X or the company in the end, it might even be acceptable to let such extreme behavior fester. Through extreme behavior, certain parts of the cult community might even forcefully get their way in the end. Although officially, everything that happened might still be labeled as appalling, behavior that shall not be repeated. But in the end, the unwanted discussion or the unwanted posts are henceforth removed from the platform as to not recreate the same incident, and thus that part of the community has won and effectively silenced opposing views. And again, sometimes this is even seemingly encouraged and enabled by the very game company or social media platform, aka the fandom, Reddit, Discord, forum, whatever. The best example is once again the recent doxing issue in Helldivers, which actually led to the discussion about the topic of glaze diving, balancing, challenges to the developers and so on to be effectively silenced. As of now, to not have the doxing incident or a similar incident happen again, discussions around the topic or adjacent topics are now more strictly moderated or outright banned. In a way, giving the aggressive extremists in the community the exact result they wanted. That being critical thought and discussions silenced, at least on their preferred platform. But what happens if not just the community, but the company itself is built like a cult? Let's finally talk of Riot Games.
Like, if you wonder how you get monsters in a business as pathetic as esports, it's that. This is why you get these male executives that feel comfortable being gross about women or then lashing out when they reject their advances. More on that later. Right, this is how you get that. The companies are like, shit, they can take away their IP, we can't have that. And if I don't have a league broadcast, I can't sell my ads, and then I don't make money, and then maybe my company has to make layoffs. And so even the most mediocre of these people, mid-level managers, they get treated like they're celebrities. They come into this is every games development company. They go to the events of the people they've hired to run their esports events. They walk in a room and they go, I don't like that. I had it with Psyonix as well. Psyonix chewed up a guy who had directed a Super Bowl when I was at WSOE. He directed the motherfucking Super Bowl, our production, and they chewed him up for not telling someone who had their shirt tucked in. They were wearing it like the style to have it tucked like out. They chewed up a guy directed a Super Bowl for not getting in that talent's here and telling him to tuck his shirt in because they thought it looked better. These people are fucking deranged across the board, and Riot are the most deranged.
When the entire company is a cult, you likely remember the bigger layoffs a while ago after the huge misconduct scandal at Riot Games. Well, all the people laid off from Riot a few years ago were labeled by Riot Games as indispensable, irreplaceable, valuable. That categorically cannot even be true. There had to be at least a few useless shitters that got fired. And let's also not forget all the abusers within that company. But this is literally Riot Games propaganda at work. No matter the situation, no matter what, twist the truth and the facts so Riot Games looks good in the end. During the hype of esports, ESL and all of the others, they all wanted to be a part of the big Riot show. They wanted a piece of the pie, the notoriety, the fame, oh yeah, and of course, the money. Thus, Riot never experienced significant pushback from their industry equals, never was challenged or had significant rivalry in the esports sector. So, other companies just followed the Riot playbook in lockstep and ran with Riot unquestionably in the hopes to get some of that money and to not be blacklisted and lose access to all of the opportunities, of course. Now this is how extreme cases of some of the male executives came into being. It was an ecosystem enabling, accepting or ignorant of any wrongdoing that these monsters did, simply because it was easier to look away and get the bag. Naturally, in such an environment, fame, power and influence might go to somebody's head, and this company ideology had very specific effects on Riot's hiring practices, indoctrination tactics and silencing dissent. Example, shoutcasters run an entire event for Riot games. Then, at the after party, they're not invited. Why? Since they're not insiders. They're not part of the campus, they're not part of the company officially. But they ran the entire event. What are they missing? What is being shown on that after party? Well, nothing. It's a simple exclusionary tactic. You're not part of Riot. It doesn't matter what you're doing for Riot. You're just a hireling. You're not officially part of the company. You are not welcome here. No critique is acceptable. Anyone who criticizes and is not somehow indispensable or cannot gotten rid of, anyone who is easily disposable will instantly get blacklisted. And if not, they invent a bunch of reasons to let you go. For example, being the most popular shoutcaster at that time, Monte Cristo. Yeah, those were one of the reasons why he was let go. He was too popular and too critical. Basically too good for his job. Riot Games employs a process of so-called denubification for newly enrolled co-workers on the Riot compound, I mean on the Riot campus. There are literal employees whose job it is to indoctrinate and introduce and enroll newbies into the Riot cult. Riot was pushing their ideologies onto their own staff to an absolute absurdity. This is how the cult indoctrination process at Riot worked. You never leave the campus, there is free lunch, free courses, free sports activities, etc, etc. You don't really leave the ecosystem, you don't leave the company building anymore. You lose your outside connection, you have friends only within the company. Hell, even your love life might be within the company in certain cases. If the company is all your life, and all your identity, of course you cannot fathom critique. Naturally, rioters react allergic to criticism. It's literally their life. Their identity is Riot Games. Remember, groupthink, identity fusion, echo chambers from the last chapter? Keep that in mind. This also explains why getting fired from Riot is such a travesty for these people. Now think about that. This is just Riot Games. But theoretically, what about other companies? Why is it always the fired developers that make it look like the world is ending? Why is it always game companies whose layoffs are treated as world-shattering events? Layoffs are a very unfortunate but also a real occurrence in big tech companies. What is so special about video games and the video game sphere? Is it potentially because at least some of these companies have or are trying to foster the same type of cult mentalities within their companies? Especially since Riot was an industry leader, thus a lot of other corpos within the same space and field might have been copying from them. For now though, Riot stands apart as the most prominent and best example of cult-like company structures. There really is no other equal to Riot Games. Maybe Activision Blizzard, but even then there are some very, very obvious differences between the companies. But we never know until a big insider leak happens. If and what another company might try to run their business like a cult in the games industry. We will never really know until someone speaks out. Naturally, if your work turns into your whole life, getting fired is obviously devastating. We don't know for sure if that is the case with all big type gaming companies, but at least with Riot we have the big example. Riot uses these same cult tactics as literal real-life cults. The same tactics they use to keep you locked into the company environment. So partially, if the company is run like a cult, does that perhaps have an effect on the fandom culture and the customers and the consumer around said company as well? Is it possible at least to assume this might enable cult-like formations within the community as well? With Riot Games, it first literally starts with love bombing. That is not a joke. An overly friendly, welcoming culture. Then you get denubified and indoctrinated, and eventually the treatment transitions into tough love. You are reshaped into the true, the good, the obedient Riot worker drone. Naturally thus, the people from Riot running the community spaces, if they are employed by Riot, are going to push the same cult ideology onto the community as well. But at least we know that Riot is indeed a special case within the industry. It is nowhere near as bad in other gaming companies. But still, the possibility stands that a cult community like Riot could form in other gaming companies. Let's also be honest for a moment, if you are a seasoned software developer, you are not going to lick someone's foot during an interview at Riot Games. Of course not. You have like a million options open to you if you have actual credentials. So most of the time Riot doesn't even get the really good workers. It just gets the ones that are deemed acceptable and malleable during the interview process, not who is the most talented person. So not only do they get the ones easier to control and manipulate, they also then aggressively bind these people to the company code and the actual location, as in the campus of Riot Games. And in addition, keep this in mind, after getting fired, you are banned from the Riot campus for 12 months for security reasons, of course. But this is also a pure cult tactic to isolate, shut out the excommunicated members. Remember, likely most of your friends are on this campus. Most of your free time is spent there. Now you got barred, you got banished, and you can't even see most of your friends anymore, at least if that's on the campus. And since they're in the cult, they're probably not leaving that campus all that often. Riot also co-opts Reddit moderators too, since their censorious behavior is advantageous to Riot Games. So the Reddit is a perfect Riot cult recruiting tool. Rioters also pull insane strings to ban people for the most insane reason, like incorrectly handling a cat on stream. We are not talking about animal abuse, we are literally just talking about a bit of an incident where an animal freaks out and is not correctly handled. That is not a case of animal abuse. That is why Riot is a cult. The Riot worker at the time, who volunteered, who acted on the false animal abuse and got that streamer banned for no reason, wanted an attaboy from the community for being a good Riot drone, for getting the evil streamer banned for the misconstrued animal abuse. That is how weird these people are. The same case with Tyler 1, if you have already forgotten. Riot wanted Tyler 1 to be de-indexed on Twitch. That is how deranged Riot is. There was even one writer who was wishing death onto Tyler publicly. Yes, this was only one person, but still, they kind of represent the company, at least the company's conduct. In addition, when the big sexual misconduct incident happened, Riot firstly hired a union-busting law firm, then they only offered 10 million as compensation and finally settled for the 100 million. Then they laid off a shit ton of people. Then they put up a front by setting up a woman for coding nonsense operation to make them look better within all of that controversy.
This company is fucking sick. They are sick. They have done terrible things with impunity to people for decades. And as I said, it's not just the executives doing these things. It is the middle managers. It is the rank and file. I mean, there was also, quite tragically, that suicide at Riot.
Oh, yes.
No one even talks about that anymore. But as I said, even right now, they're doing the same shit in Valorant. They're having a clean out of like legendary broadcast talent based on, oh, they're too popular, they're too big for the boots, let's break that group apart. They are literally throwing a bag of money into a ring and making the fucking outside broadcast talent they hire in Valorant fight each other for it, while they write down notes about who showed the most loyalty to Riot, who was willing to go far enough, who was willing to do disgusting, reprehensible things to their colleagues just to get this job. Who wants it more? These people are fucking evil, man. Like, I could go another 5 hours. I won't. It makes me sick to my stomach what this company has done to so many of my friends, so many of my colleagues, even total strangers that I've watched from afar have these awful things done to, and said about. And it's the tip of the iceberg. You thought you cleaned them all out with that $100 million lawsuit? Not even fucking close, guys. Not even close. And by the way, what does it say now? Right? Oh, they've totally changed, guys. Look, they've set up a coding for women group and paid $100 million. They fought tooth and nail to not pay a penny. They hired a union-busting law firm to basically harass and intimidate the complainants, and then settled after they offered 10 million, then settled for 100. And then on top of this, they're now doing these layoffs. And what are we learning about with the LEC and other parts of the company? People are doing multiple jobs. Their bonuses are being wielded like a cudgel when they live in the most expensive city in the world, and every fucking penny counts. Right? And that's what they're doing to that's what they're doing to the people who get to stay. And everyone's telling me they've changed. No, guys. No. If you stand with this company, it's going to bite you eventually. Your conscience will get to you eventually. This company is rotten to the core. It is the worst company I've ever seen across the entirety of video games. To all my freelancers, I know you like the games. I know you want to be part of the show. I know you just want to turn up and talk about something you're passionate about. Getting into bed with Riot is getting into bed with the devil. They do not respect you, and there is a very heavy price to pay at the end of the transactional experience. And you will agree with this. And they're doing it, as I said, they're still doing it. They're doing it right now. They're doing it to talent right now. Right now.
So that is Riot Games. The worst, the absolute worst, and the prime example. So how fucked is a gaming community if the company itself is set up and run like a cult? Well, pretty much completely fucked, I would say. How do you escape the cult? This might not specifically be the answer some gamers might want to hear, but I can perhaps rephrase it a little bit. Find another game, find another company, find another community that actually respects you as an individual, your hobby, and your money. And maybe don't use Reddit and Twitter, but I'm gonna stop with that point. Now let's go to the conclusion. Quick little conclusion here at the end. So how satisfying were my findings in the end? How satisfied am I with what I was able to find out? Well, I have to admit I'm a bit disappointed by the lack of actual study material that I was able to find. Then again, maybe I didn't have the right access, or I did not search the right terms. There's lots of discussion around how gamers turn racist and extremist within their community spaces, but not really how the corporations and especially gaming spaces and the modern ideologies around gaming play into all of this. That is always never taken into account. Yeah, I know online groups might turn people more verbally abusive and maybe even violent, but why do we always only look at that one political viewpoint? It's always just the isms, the words that you can neatly put into an article. But I see different issues prevail in online gaming communities too. It's not just racism and sexism, it's the discussion around monetization being poisoned, more and more predatory manipulation of consumers of a game, a total lack of accountability on places like Reddit and X, the never-ending circle jerk debate over what is woke and not, the total inability of introspection and trying to see or understand the other side of the argument. Yeah, a lot of scientific findings can be extrapolated to fit the gaming space and niche, as it all kind of functions like any other social media group, but still, I would have liked to find a bit more specifically about the gaming space. It really all comes down to a handful of articles, and I almost think that is not really enough. It seems this topic is either not very popular, or maybe not interesting, or maybe some of the bigger players involved might not want more studies on the effects of brain-dead consumerism, exploitation, and indoctrination of their loyal gaming audience. Who knows? But I was really having some difficulties finding anything that actually specifically talks about gaming communities. And even then it's just about all the evil right-winger incels doing the sexism and the racism. Is there really nothing deeper to glean from group echo chambers within gaming communities such as Reddit? Is it all just racism evil, incels evil, right-wingers evil? I mean, I guess there's nothing else to glean there in the eyes of the sciences. However, I think this video can still be interesting to listen to anyway, even though I did not fully find what I was searching for. I hope you could take something from this too, hopefully. And with that, I will see you next time.
you.